Alright, Drips Swift here, and today we're going to be going over some of the basics of scene setup as it relates to 3D, and broadly go over some of the different approaches to making maps that you might take. Since there's going to be a lot in here, and I'm going to be giving a fairly in-depth explanation for everything we go over, I'm going to make sure to put on timestamps down in the description for each section. So if there's one option or group of options that you need info on, check down there. When it comes to the scenes themselves, all the settings you'll already be familiar with from base Foundry will be in there. So, name, grid size, vision settings, lighting, this is all the same stuff you've seen before. And then all the new stuff is on this 3D Canvas tab over here. So I'm going to go through these to start with and talk about when you might use them and what they do. The first thing to note is that when you first come to this tab, only the basic settings will be visible. If you'd like to see more, you need to click on this Show Advanced Settings button down here, which will switch the menu to a longer version that has more options visible. While we go through this, I'm just going to leave this option on, so if you're looking at the menu and you don't see an option, try checking the Advanced Settings button. Anyway, so the basics. These ones up here are pretty self-explanatory. Enable for players, for instance, just means that players will be able to see the 3D version of the map if you've got that checked. Enable 3D on load means that when you first come to a map, if this is checked, then it'll just go straight to the 3D mode. It'll skip the 2D entirely. So if you've got a scene that is done, that's generally a good idea to tick that. Use 3D geometry for site calculations is one of the big ones. So one of the advantages of 3D is that you don't have to deal with Foundry walls or anything. You can just use the actual models to do it. Like, for instance, I've got it turned on here, and we've got this paladin over here, and then this cleric over here. If I click on the cleric, the paladin disappears because she can't see him. We move around the wall, he appears, so it becomes visible. So we've got wall functionality built straight in there. Worth noting that use 3D geometry for site calculations doesn't hide anything at all. Any tiles, that is. Like, for example, if we select this elf cleric here, even if we move them right up to the wall, they can still see the trees over there. And similarly, over here, they can still see that tavern. So the actual geometry doesn't get hidden. That'll be other options, but it does hide tokens. And as a result, it is very, very performant. You don't have to worry about it causing lag or anything when you've got that enabled. So the next option down is Enable Game Camera. This is another one that can really change how your sessions feel in 3D. By default, it is on, though of course you can turn it off for everybody or just turn it off for yourself as the DM. And basically what it does is it limits the camera so that it can only zoom out so far, and it can only tilt up or down so far. So it puts constraints on it. I'll just turn it on here to show you what I mean. So with the game camera on here, I can only zoom out this far, which is still quite far, but not an unlimited amount. And I can only tilt it up or down a little bit. You can change how far the limits are in the settings, but with this, you can have your sessions feel a lot more like a kind of traditional CRPG, where your players are kind of more constrained to their player characters, which can be, an advantage depending on what you want to do. Let's turn that back off there. Generally speaking, I'll turn the game camera off while I'm building a scene, but then once a scene is done, depending on what it is and how I want it to feel, I could turn the game camera on and then have, players locked to that camera when they come in. So the next option down is Fog of War, which is a pretty big one. This is more like what you might be used to when you think about site calculations, in that it draws a black shroud over anything that a player's token hasn't seen. Currently, it's tied to Foundry's own Fog of War and works pretty well. Due to the way that the Fog of War in Foundry works, it is quite performance heavy, as it says here. However, with recent updates, there's been some experimental multi-threading techniques that Ripper's been using to make it go a lot faster. I'll just show you what that looks like here. If I click on this human fighter here, you can now see that with Fog of War enabled, there is a, black shroud drawn over everything. If you had the background be black, for example, then things like these trees in this building would be hidden. But if I move this guy out, then you see that the fog of war makes way for what's inside there. And as we move him over, more and more of it gets uncovered. Sometimes can be a little bit jittery, but I think it works really quite well. The maximum elevation is how high tokens can be moved in the scene. So this can be quite handy if you've got a map that is relatively flat, because sometimes the players could accidentally pick up their token and put it on top of a wall, which could mean that they can see over it, which, you know, is kind of annoying. Whereas if you set the max elevation to, say, 4, then if you tried to move it on top of the wall, you would just get attempted movement exceeds the maximum elevation, and it wouldn't be able to do it. So if you've got a fairly flat, fairly simple map, you can use that to stop people from accidentally hopping over walls. Otherwise, it could be just useful for making sure that players are not able to exceed a certain height. The ruler is obviously just, you know, the measuring stick when you try to move things around, or you use the actual measure distance tool. You can turn it on or off as you like. And the initial view position is pretty important, I think. Basically, whenever or when you load into the scene, initial view position will set where the camera is. So if I move away to another scene, and then if I move back to the empty scene, and then I turn on 3D mode, you see the camera is back here in the default pose. But if I wanted the players to start by seeing this little stage area, what I could do is move the camera here. I'll just open the configuration window. Press Shift and Q to set a specific target, in this case just the middle of the scene, and then click on this little button here for Capture Camera View to capture this position for the camera. So now if I move away to this other scene, and then move back, turn on 3D, the camera starts here. So if you've got a dungeon or something, then you can set the initial camera position to be at the entrance, so that when the players load in, they can see all their tokens gathered together at the entrance, ready to go on an adventure, sort of thing. So all those settings that we just went over in the basics section, they're mostly to do with when the scene loads, whether or not major functions are on or off. The rest of the settings are all about how the scene looks. You won't necessarily use all of these on every scene. The default settings look absolutely fine for a lot of situations, but we'll go over them here so they can be more useful to you in the future. So this first section, environment, is all about the skybox and general atmosphere of the scene. These first two settings, HDRI and skybox image, might make sense to 3D artists and the like, but it might be a bit difficult to describe the difference between them. The skybox is what you see when you look over the side of the table. It's great for creating a backdrop, or for what's going on around the table, or just generally setting a mood. But other than that, it doesn't interact with the scene at all. And the HDRI is normally not visible, but it's what's actually casting light onto the scene. So you might notice, for instance, that this scene has a kind of blue tinge to it, and that's because the HDRI is a bright blue scene, the one you can actually see there, because you don't actually have a skybox image. So even if I change the skybox to something like this darker orangey area, the board itself is still covered in this blue light. If I change the HDRI though, let's say to this dusk sky, then you'll notice it's a lot more of a kind of yellowy, orangey tinge to things, which better matches the skybox here, but they are disconnected. So the short version is the skybox is what you actually see when you look off the side of the board. The HDRI is what actually casts light down onto the board and is responsible for the overall kind of color of the light that's coming in from outside. It sounds kind of complicated, but you'll find it quite intuitive once you start changing it around. These other options are a lot simpler. Display background actually refers to this white surface here, like the table type thing. If your scene has an image as the background, it'll appear here, so you can just have 3D minis walking around on a 2D map, which does look pretty cool. We'll look into that more later. If you disable it, it disappears entirely. which can be useful depending on the map you're making. If, for example, it's an interior, or if it goes down below the floor, then disabling that can be pretty good for that. Bloom is similar to what you might expect from other games. Whiter or brighter objects seem to glow, washing out things around them on the camera. I'll just turn that on here. You can tweak its strength and how much of the screen it covers with the slide bars just below it. Be careful with overdoing it, of course. You can easily just make it really blow out everything in the scene. And I think it does look pretty cool on a lot of scenes to have a bit of bloom there. So I'll turn that back off, and then we'll look at the next option. Filter is also pretty self-explanatory. Like, for example, you could put a sepia filter in there, and then the whole scene's in sepia. Very simple, very straightforward, very performant as well. So let's try grayscale there. I can see that being really useful for, say, a scene that's supposed to be a memory or in an alternate plane or something. It's also pretty cool, and it's really super easy to use. You can also use some filters like, say, contrast to increase or decrease the contrast of a scene, say, if you want to do some artistic stuff that way, or, you know, brightness, hue, saturation, or even just an entirely custom filter. Pretty easy to use, pretty great to get interesting effects. So the next option, display table, actually renders a table beneath the map here. What you need to do is give it a texture. Let's say this wooden texture here. And so the table stretches out to the very edge of the scene and is a 3D object that's sort of below the actual play area. This could be pretty cool if you're trying to mimic a kind of tabletop situation. You can put any texture you like on here and end up with a pretty good effect. And the last option on here is fog, which, rather than being the fancy particle kind, is the good old-fashioned distance haze that limits how far everyone can see. This is great for underground areas or just spooky dark places, your silent hills, your underground caverns. You can change the color as well, so you could have strange lands with a colored fog. Say if we make this some kind of purple. So the added advantage of there's barely any performance required to use it, so you can use it on pretty much any scene. Another one of those tools that, with a bit of imagination, you could use for all sorts of things I quite rather like. So let me just turn that off. And the next section, lighting, is also pretty straightforward. This mostly controls the sun, as well as just the overall brightness of the scene. The scene tint is just an easy way to give everything a specific color to it. Say if we are trying to go for a spooky undead green kind of glow to things, I could just set the scene tint to that, and now everything has a kind of sickly green glow to it. Very nice, very easy, absolutely no performance cost whatsoever. You can also turn on automatic lighting, which links up the position of the sun with either the world time, which you can control elsewhere, or the scene darkness, which, you know, make a scene lighter or darker as in traditional Foundry, or sync both, so, you know, both the world time and the scene darkness. So that basically just controls these sliders down here. So the time of day slider is, like we say, the position of the sun. At 12, the sun is directly overhead. If you move this slider to the left, the sun moves to the right. If you move it to the right, the sun moves to the left. Relatedly, there's also the sun tilt, which, for want of a better word, moves the sun forward or back, so that you don't have to have shadows that are exactly perpendicular, which can look unnatural depending on what you're doing. The exposure lightens or darkens the entire scene. It doesn't quite do it evenly. Dark places get darker quicker, and light places get lighter quicker. So if you tweak it a bit, you can get some great effects with deeper shadows or brighter highlights. sun distance is the actual distance from the table of the sun object. Because we don't have an actual infinitely distant object to cast the sun's rays, it is actually just a sphere that's quite nearby but is invisible. If you've got some, say, very, very large object in your scene, or if you're getting some odd issues with oddly shaped shadows, you could move the sun closer or further away. It'll also slightly change the shape of the shadows, so mostly this is a troubleshooting thing. And shadow bias is also a troubleshooting thing. So on some scenes you might notice that the shadows look quite striped. In this scene, obviously, they're quite smooth, but, you know, if there was, say, vertical lines running up and down this, then shadow bias would be the thing to change. By default, it's on this negative 0.00018, which seems to be good for most scenes. But if you notice those shadow artifacts, you can increase or decrease that by a small amount, and it should fix that for you. So that's the lighting section covered. The particle section, very short section, as you can see here, preset 1 and 2. This is a very simple way to get some environmental effects into your scene. Each drop down will have a series of options, like, say, heavy rain here, or snow, say. And these will cover the entire table evenly, and they've been quite heavily optimized by Ripper, so they should basically have no effect on frame rate or the like, and they can really amp up a scene. Mysterious lights for when you're traveling through the Feywild. And there's also, in preset 2, there is a custom option, which allows you to set your own texture and then also change all of the attributes of the behavior of the particles. So if you've got a very specific particle effect in mind, maybe you've got, say, a different type of rain, or, you know, maybe you've got some snow that's falling up, or the air is on fire, you know. The sky's the limit with this sort of thing. Basically means that you can create any custom effect you like and end up with pretty great effects using just these sliders in here. And this last part, visibility, is another bit of probably a bit of a troubleshooting bit. You're working on a scene, or if you're trying to do something specific, you can just completely disable certain things. Walls and doors here refers to Foundry's own walls and doors. If I, for example, pop into 2D and draw a wall, then by default it will appear here in 3D. However, I can disable rendering walls, and then it just entirely disappears. You can also disable the rendering of tiles or lights, which, if you're doing something specific, might be useful. And then the very useful one, if you're doing multi-level structures, is mirror levels tile visibility, which basically means that if a tile would be made invisible by the levels module, then it is also made invisible in 3D. So if you have a multi-level structure where the players walk inside and then the upper floors are made invisible, that'll be what will happen with this here. It's very good. So with that all gone through there, that's the general configuration setup of a 3D scene that you might use for any given scene. The video is getting a bit long, but before we wrap up, let's talk a little bit about the different kinds of maps that you might want to use or create. So this is absolutely by no means an exhaustive list, and isn't even what I'd call necessarily correct. It's just the way I kind of think about different maps. It might help you conceptualize ideas for maps you might have in the future. I'll start off with talking about imported maps. So imported maps, technically a map types, but obviously it's a very simple concept. It's just a map you've imported from outside. So say if we go over to the compendiums, down to the Bailiwiki 3D scenes, and then pick one out, like say for instance, Bloody Halls 3D here. Just click on import on that. And then you've got a map ready to go, pre-made, already set up. Excellent. You can also, of course, use the Browse Community 3D Maps feature that we've talked about in the past. This list here will be growing all the time, so do check back periodically. So if you see something you like in here, like say this 3D Lake House by Bailey himself, then we just click on this download button. And then bam, we've got a new map, and we can just activate it. and you've got a map ready to use. So, obviously, pretty simple concept, but very, very useful. Very good to be able to just grab a map ready to go right off the community here, and then immediately make use of it. So, on to making maps in 3D Canvas. So one of the simplest ways to create a map in 3D is to start off with a 2D one. Like, I'll take a look at this one here. It's a military camp by Tom Cartos. It's got some different types of walls laid up to make a fort structure here. We've got the standard Foundry walls in all the different types. We've got some lights arranged around the place. These are all just the normal things that you would see in Foundry to begin with. You've got, say, Hero Bob here, who can't see outside the fort because of the walls there. But if we switch to 3D mode, you'll see here I've got a 3D mini set up on this 2D map, but we've also got all these walls around the place, which doesn't look great. But if we just go into Configure here, and then Disable Render Walls, now we've got ourselves a 2D map with 3D features that works just fine. With the visibility mirroring Foundry's Fog of War, exactly the same as you would expect it to work. And you can even use things like, say, the 3D particle effect to add in a little bit of atmosphere. That rain's maybe a little bit heavy here. And so with this sort of setup, you've essentially got something that's kind of like Tabletop Simulator, except with all the systems and tools that are already built into Foundry, and the extra tools on top of that brought in by 3D Canvas. Some maps you'll find are actually made up of many tiles overlapping each other, and that can cause problems with flickering, which is called Z-fighting, but single image maps should work right out of the box. If you do have a map that has a lot of overlapping tiles, there's a module called DF Architect that has a tile flattener function that would make this absolutely perfect for 3D Canvas. As of this video, it is temporarily unavailable due to a problem with another module though, but hopefully in the near future that'll be working. So the next type of map I'd like to talk about is what I'm calling exterior type maps, though they aren't necessarily outdoors, they could be indoors or underground or the like. But the thing with them is that they are a lot of assets and decorations placed onto the map in a way that just, seems right for a map. Like in this case here, the floor is made up of a dynamic box mesh that's had, just the box here, that's had the gradient shader applied to it so that it can have the grass on the higher section and the dirt on the lower section. And then it's had tree objects placed around the place along with rocks and flowers and bushes and all that sort of thing. Usually this, having all the trees everywhere, would cause a fair amount of performance drop, but with this new feature, the merge all tiles, that kind of combines assets together. Like for example, several trees here are actually all the same object, and that really cuts down on the kind of frame rate reduction that you might get with that normally. So with maps like this, it's really rather flexible. There's also quite easy to modify into a more battle map type situation. Like if you got this terrain object down here and applied the grid shader to it, for example, then suddenly that's very easy to use as a battle map. And then you can just use the grid settings in the map itself to change like how thick the lines are or how opaque they are. Likewise, you could add more things to the map using the 3D asset browser here. Like say we wanted to add a broken down cart in the middle of the road here. We'll just pull that out there. Pull it down into the road. So maybe that's a sign that the party are about to be ambushed by bandits that have been preying upon this route. Maybe you could add a few bags and crates and things around nearby to give it a bit more environmental storytelling here. You can keep it even simpler than that, of course. Like for example, this old courtyard map by Fin4 2020. What he's done here is make pretty good use of the rock objects to create a natural backdrop for the scene. and then scattered in some tiles from the asset browser to create this kind of old abandoned courtyard kind of environment here. And that's all just placed directly on the default floor, I suppose, here. So, you know, don't need to go too complicated for it. You can get some great effects with very simple maps here. The main thing with the map type is that you can be very freeform with it. If you've got a general idea for the kind of environment you'd like an encounter to take place in, you can really just open up the asset browser and just start throwing things down onto the board. If you had a bit of practice, you could probably even do it on the fly, similar to how you might draw out a map for your players as they explore it in 2D, if you've ever done that. The next broad type of map I'd like to speak of is interior type maps. And same with the exteriors. I call them interiors, but really they could be used for exteriors as well. You know, what I'm mostly meaning is the environment is mostly made up of tiles. A great example of this is the Chamber of Eyes by Smothmoth. And just by looking at it, you can see that it is a very classic dungeon setup that they've got going on here. Except that they've been able to add in verticality that's a lot more easy to visualize because it's visible. What they've also done is something I quite like doing as well, that I think looks pretty cool, which is covering up the gaps in between walls with tiles. Like if we select this here and move it up, all they've done here is put down some black cubes to cover up all the gaps in the walls and then link them all up so that it's just all instanced and barely costs any resources at all. We've also been able to do things like this boss arena here with ledges around the outside for a real multi-leveled combat kind of situation. And the interior maps might seem a little bit more complicated because they're made up of a lot more individual pieces, but I find that things like dungeons are easier to visualize. And there's plus, we've also had decades of people designing dungeons in great detail already, and they make great candidates for 3Difying. Like, for example, there's Cobalt Hall here, also by Smothmoth. And this is a 3D recreation of the starter dungeon from D&D 4th edition. So, it's all made inside 3D canvas. There's no need for any technical know-how or knowing how to make your own 3D assets or anything. In this case, they're using various assets from the Bailey Wiki pack to make the floor and decorate the rooms. And then I believe what they've done is they've used the terrain generator that comes with 3D canvas to make these walls. So they've opened up the terrain generator, they've set the heights on all the walls, and then they've applied a clay texture to it to give it this sort of blue-grey effect here. So with the tools available in 3D Canvas and the huge amount of content that's out there already for dungeons and the like, I think there's enough stuff here to have you set adventure-wise for quite a while. So that about covers setting up a scene, what the various options do, as well as providing a few ways to think about map creation that'll hopefully get the gears turning and make thinking about these maps and how to make them a bit easier. We'll be steadily coming out with more how to 3D maps in the future, of course. There's several features in 3D Canvas that I think really deserve a video all on their own to talk about. What I would be interested in, though, is hearing your ideas or opinions for what parts of 3D Canvas really need to be talked about. Like, are there any elements that you think people seem to be having trouble with? Or is there anything that you're having trouble with? Let us know in the comments below. I'll certainly give them all a read, and it's valuable feedback. For now, though, this is Swift signing off. See ya.